"Sir, my little sister can't walk." The voice came small and raw, the words pushed between sobs and the wind off the avenue. Ricardo froze with his hand on the car door. For a moment the city fell away. The honking, the screens on the buildings, the calendar alerts in his head, until the boy's arms stretched higher, pleading, like two thin branches reaching for shelter. He had a meeting in 15 minutes that could change everything at his company. It was the sort of meeting he had built his life around. Numbers, projections, investors waiting in a polished boardroom 3 blocks away. His assistant, Claudia, had already confirmed the schedule twice that morning. Jorge, his driver, had the route memorized. The watch on his wrist ticked loudly enough that he could feel the pressure of time like a physical thing. But the child would not let him go. The toddler in the boy's other arm rocked with a sound that was half cry, half breathe. Her dress was thin for the season and rhymed with dust. Her hair stuck to her forehead in soft, damp curls. When she lifted her face, her eyes found his as if searching for someone to steady them. Ricardo closed the car door. He walked toward the pair without the theatrics of a man used to being noticed. No entourage, no speech. Just a quiet step into the small orbit of 3 lives in need. Up close, the boy's hands were calloused and the toddler's shoes too big at the toes. The boy, Pedro he would later learn, kept one arm steady under the toddler's bottom, like scaffolding. He spoke for her because she could not make the words form. "She can't walk, sir," he said again, as if repetition would carve the plea into reality. People on the sidewalk moved with practiced indifference. A woman brushed by without looking. A man with a briefcase crossed the street and pretended not to notice. The contrast struck Ricardo more sharply than anything. He had seen poverty on figures, on charity boards, on glossy slides. He had not seen it in the immediate raw shape of a child's plea. There was a bakery 2 doors down. A bell chimed whenever the door opened, and the smell of fresh bread spilled into the street like a warm, inevitable mercy. Ricardo stepped inside with them. The bakery was small, a handful of tables, the air thick with butter and yeast. The baker, an older man with flour on his forearms, looked up and nearly swallowed his surprise when he saw the toddler's cheeks. Claudia's voice on Ricardo's phone was a thin thread, asking where he was. He silenced it without answering. They sat at a table near the window. Pedro ordered with a seriousness that made Ricardo smile through the edges of pain. 2 rolls and a coffee for him, a cup of warm milk for the toddler. The boy fed his sister first, rolling bread into tiny bits, making sure the milk came before his own coffee. He tore his portion into pieces and placed them in her lap like offerings. "Don't take too big," Pedro warned, watching with the vigilance of someone who had seen too many things go wrong. His thumb rubbed the toddler's hand as if checking that she was still there. Ricardo watched small movements, how Pedro's jaw tightened whenever a waiter glanced over, how the toddler leaned her head against Pedro's shoulder when she was calm enough to do so. He put money on the table, but the boy refused to take coins as charity. He wanted dignity, not pity. So Ricardo paid with an ordinary exchange. He bought the food, but he also bought trust. He adjusted his posture to be plainly human. When the toddler's mouth found the milk and her breathing eased, Pedro relaxed slightly and turned his attention to Ricardo. "You're going to help?" he asked. Not the way a child asks candy from a stranger, but the way someone tries to set a stake in the future. Ricardo put out his pinky. The gesture felt small and old-fashioned, but Pedro took it without hesitation. Their fingers interlocked in a pinky promise. 2 different lives sealed in a tiny knot. The promise was not a contract. It was a human vow. "I won't leave you," Ricardo said. Pedro's face, which had been all sharp edges and worry, softened into something close to relief. He whispered, "She knows people," and tapped his chest, meaning trust. If a camera had been pointed at that table, it would have captured an unexpected domesticity. Crumbs on the paper napkin, a streak of jam at the toddler's chin, Ricardo's cuff brushing flour on the baker's sleeve, the city beyond the glass continuing to rush on. But for the 3 in the bakery, time folded inward. A new sound intruded, the shrill ring of Ricardo's phone. Claudia's voice, now more urgent, asked again where he was. He answered plainly and then put the phone on speaker so Pedro could hear the conversation if he needed to. "I'll call the police," Ricardo said. "I won't let you go back on the street." Pedro's eyes widened and his fingers tightened on the toddler's dress. The word police had the weight of a threat built from broken promises. "They'll take her," he blurted. "They take kids and put them in big homes. She'll be—" "Not if I can help it," Ricardo interrupted. He leaned forward, close enough to be in Pedro's space without invading it. "I promise you, Pedro. Mind and pinky promise. I will make sure she stays with people who love her. We will find your mom." The boy's answer was a whisper. "Promise." That line, so small and so enormous, hung between them. Outside, the city moved. Inside the bakery, the world rearranged itself to make room for a single family of 3. Ricardo called the police. He gave their location, described the children, and asked for a welfare check. Then he called a friend at a local shelter to ask about immediate care options, the sort that came with social workers, and not the cold institutionalities Pedro feared. He asked for discretion. He wanted gentleness, not headlines. While they waited, Pedro told him a few things in halting bursts. His mother's name was Luciana. She worked nights at a laundry until a few weeks ago. She'd been accused of taking something she hadn't taken and then didn't go home. Pedro's words were not all coherent. Children carry grief in fragments, but the image was clear. Accusation, dismissal, a door shut that should have remained open. Ricardo's mind kept ricocheting back to the meeting he had left behind. The investment presentation, the faces, the contracts. He had a ledger of obligations, a rhythm of expectations that had guided him since he was young. But the ledger did not include the weight of a toddler's small arm around someone's neck, or the look 2 children gave a stranger who had chosen to stop. Claudia arrived at the bakery, breathless, her hair tucked behind one ear. Her expression flicked from the role of professional assistant to something softer when she saw the children. "Ricardo," she said, more statement than question. "We can reschedule. Take the time you need. But what's the plan?" The plan, at that moment, was simple. Wait for the police, get the toddler some medical attention if needed, and not let Pedro lose his mother to a system that looked like it might break more than it fixed. Claudia nodded and sat down, pulling the meeting organizer from her bag as if to stand ready for any pivot. Minutes stretched and the bakery's warmth became a small refuge. When the police car finally arrived, a uniformed officer stepped in and knelt to Pedro's level. He asked gentle, trained questions. He promised to do a welfare check, to see if anyone at the park recognized the children, to look for a missing person report. He wrote down details: Luciana's name, last known workplace, the description of the necklace Pedro mentioned, an item the boy insisted his mother would never wear because she didn't like jewelry. Pedro flinched each time the officer used the word orphanage. The memory of that idea was a jagged thing. Ricardo could see it reshaping the boy's thin shoulders into something older than his years. He held the toddler closer and whispered to Ricardo that foster homes were where children cried themselves to sleep because they missed the smell of their own house. Ricardo listened and promised again, quietly, in the language Pedro needed. He put his hand on the boy's head and felt a small warm pulse beneath the hair, a life that had been carrying weight too heavy for any child. The officer called his sergeant and then the dispatcher. After a pause, the phone crackled with a voice that made everyone in the bakery lean a little closer. "We've got a report. Woman found unconscious in Central Park. We're bringing her to São Lucas Hospital. Name matches a missing person report filed by a neighbor." The words landed like a new turn in a story. Ricardo paid the bill, more with the movement of a man set to action than with calculation. He made a call to Seu Jorge. "Head to São Lucas," he said. "Now." There was no room for the meeting anymore. He told Claudia to inform his team that he would handle the fallout and thanked her, meaning everything in the way he did not go back into business talk. On the drive to the hospital, the city blurred into strips of light and shadow. Ricardo watched Pedro cradle Bia in the back seat like an artifact. He thought of all the decisions that had brought him to that point. The long hours, the mentorship he'd received, the people who had believed in him. He thought, too, of moments when someone else had stepped in for him, a cousin who lent him money, a neighbor who taught him carpentry, and how those acts had been tended like small seeds that sprouted into the life he now led. The thought passed through him like a quiet directive: repay the kindness by being kind. The emergency room had that antiseptic pulse hospitals hold, a mix of fluorescent light and soft, urgent voices. Nurses moved with efficient calm. A doctor took Luciana's vitals while the young woman who had been found in the park lay pale and still on the stretcher. Her skin showed the stark lines of someone who had gone without adequate food and sleep. Her fingers were thin as twigs. There were bruises that might have come from a fall. There were no obvious marks of violence, but the exhaustion in her face suggested more than a single accident. Pedro did not move when they rolled Luciana into the triage bay. He stood like a shield in the doorway, Bia tucked against his hip, eyes fixed on the bed where a blanket pulled close on someone who could be their mother. The doctor asked him to step closer, to say her name. He whispered with the raw hope of the desperate. Luciana. A nurse bent down and held the boy's hands. "Do you know her?" she asked. Pedro closed his eyes as if trying to recall the way his mother hummed when she ironed shirts, the small rituals of a household that had once been their stronghold. Then he nodded and pointed to the blanket. "That's her," he said. "That's my mom." Identification in a hospital is both administrative and sacred. They checked a photograph, the shape of a mole by an ear, an old bracelet with a tiny charm that Pedro identified as the one she always wore. When Luciana's eyes fluttered open, they found a face that remembered the world only in fragments. She mumbled disjointed words before her gaze sharpened and landed on the boy at the doorway. Recognition moved through her like a tide. She reached out with a hand that trembled, and Pedro crossed the room to take it. The scene was terrible and holy at once. The mother and son, connected by breathed names and frail fingers, made something of the hospital bed that no chart could measure. Luciana's voice when it came was as thin as tissue, but the name she said was the one that anchored the whole room. Pedro. Ricardo stood back and let them have that moment. A doctor leaned in and explained things in clear, careful sentences. Luciana was severely malnourished and dehydrated. She had signs of chronic exhaustion and needed immediate care. Fluids, nutrition plans, monitoring. The kind of recovery she needed could not be rushed by wishes. It would take time, professionals, and consistency. The doctor also suggested social services be involved to ensure long-term safety for the children. "Was she assaulted?" Ricardo asked, his voice low. The question was not accusation. It was a practical need for an answer. The doctor shook his head. "No signs of recent major trauma, but we'll do full screenings. Sometimes the stress of living without food and sleep can create symptoms that mimic injury." Luciana blinked, trying to weave together the thin threads of memory. She said something about being accused of taking a necklace, an accusation with the weight of being a door slammed in her face. She said the name of the business where she'd worked, mumbling the way someone repeats a name that previously made up their world. Her words were disjointed, but the shape of an injustice became visible like a map laid out over a table. Ricardo felt a familiar legal instinct quietly raise its head, something he had learned in the corporate trenches. Find the facts, follow them, and let them tell the story. This was not a case study, this was a life, but the mechanics of truth and untruth were the same. If someone had falsely accused Luciana, it would not be right to let the accusation stand unchallenged. It would not be right to let a family be fractured into pieces by a lie. Yet he also felt the immediate human obligation to ensure Luciana received proper medical care, that the children were safe, that their dignity was preserved in every step. He signed a form and asked the nurse about visitation hours, about what they could do now. The nurse asked for a contact person. Ricardo wrote his name. Pedro stayed by the bed, one hand holding his mother's, the other stroking her hair as if it were a soft, secret braid. Bia, exhausted from the day's motion and the drama around her, had curled into a heap on a spare blanket and finally dozed. Luciana's breathing grew steadier now that she was under a sheet and under attention. Her face, when she slept, looked like a map that had been smoothed by a hand that promised a path. There were practicalities to resolve. The hospital would keep Luciana for observation, start rehydration, and coordinate social services. The police officer who had responded offered to file an official report and to begin a missing persons follow-up. Ricardo thanked him, and when the officer stepped away to make a call, Ricardo felt the pull of a different role, not as a man of means throwing money at a problem, but as someone who could use resources responsibly to seek truth and safety. He thought of the pinky promise again, that small loop of trust with Pedro. The promise had been meant to buy time and safety. Now it looked like it might have to hold the weight of more than protection for a single night. It might have to stretch into months of support and, possibly, into a longer fight to clear a name. When Luciana woke enough to focus her eyes on him, Ricardo saw a flash of the person she was before everything unraveled. A woman with the quick, bright laugh of someone who'd once found joy in small things. She murmured something that might have been prayer or memory. "God placed an angel," she said haltingly, as if searching for a word. The phrase was personal, not proclaiming doctrine. It landed in the room like the simplest gratitude. Ricardo introduced himself softly. "I'm Ricardo," he said. "I found Pedro and Bia, and—" He let the sentence trail, because it held too much to be said simply. Luciana's eyes filled with tears. The look she gave him was a mixture of shame, relief, and sudden, sharp hope. "I thought I'd lost them," she whispered. "You didn't," he answered. Outside the room, the city continued. People returned to their routines, meetings, negotiations, errands, unaware that a small private justice had just begun to breathe. Inside the hospital, a different kind of movement unfolded. The slow, methodical work of doctors and nurses, the soft adjustment of sheets, the small acts that make survival possible again. It would not be instant. There would be nights of uncertainty. There would be appointments and programs and people with forms and questions. There would also be, flickering under the exhaustion, the chance to rebuild. When Ricardo stepped into the corridor, his phone buzzed with messages about the postponed meeting. He read them with one eye, and then set the device face down. The decision he had made at the bakery formed itself into a course of action in his mind. The word that kept surfacing was responsibility, not as a weight, but as an obligation that comes with the power to act. He spoke with Claudia in a hushed voice, mapping out what they could do immediately. Temporary housing for the children, in-home care for Luciana when the hospital released her, a plan to ensure Pedro could go back to school. But his mind kept returning to the question that sits at the heart of so many wrongful dismissals. How had an accusation become a conviction in the eyes of employers and neighbors? Who had benefited when Luciana was pushed out? He listened to the hospital's social worker explain the process for documenting Luciana's condition. He learned how carefully the evidence of neglect or wrongdoing must be handled in order to help the family reclaim their place. The social worker advised patients with the legal steps, the police report, the follow-up, the collection of witness statements. "We'll do what we can," she said, "but it's a process." Ricardo left the hospital that evening with 2 children asleep in the car and a woman under care inside. He could have dispersed the resources right then, paid the bills, found an immediate apartment, set up temporary schooling, but he also felt the stirrings of something more deliberate, the need to discover how this had happened, to find the truth beyond the rumor, to bring light into a small, painful corner of the city where assumption and gossip had already done harm. In the quiet of the drive back, he touched the pinky of his right hand, where Pedro's small finger had been linked that afternoon, and thought of how fragile promises could become the scaffolding for lives. He thought of the moment he had chosen to step out of his car, and the way the city around him might have continued without missing a beat if he had not. He did not believe himself heroic. He believed he had merely been asked, in a small human voice, to be present. When they pulled up to his building, he made a decision that would shape the coming days. He would not let the story end with Luciana's hospital stay. He would help document her recovery. He would learn who had accused her and why. He would not allow a single lie to stay in place if he could discover the truth. Before they left the car, Ricardo knelt down to Pedro's level. "Tomorrow," he said. "I'll be here. We'll make sure she gets the care she needs, and we'll see to the rest." Pedro nodded, the set of his mouth hard with new, tentative hope. He tucked Bia's head under his chin and, as if to punctuate the promise again, offered his pinky. Ricardo took it, and the tiny loop closed with the quiet authority of an oath. They walked into the building with the weight of the day behind them, and the weight of what might come ahead. In the lobby, Claudia waited with a folder of contacts and a list of people who could help secure a place for the family while Luciana recovered. Seu Jorge made arrangements for the children's immediate needs. The machinery of care began to turn. But beneath logistical plans, a private question sat in Ricardo's chest like a coiled spring. Who would plant a story and watch a life fall apart? The answer did not come that night. What came instead was a resolution, quiet and personal. To follow the facts, to follow the people, and to do it with a patience that matched the slow work of healing. The next morning, while the city awoke in its habitual hurry, Ricardo sat at his desk and wrote a short note, not for investors, not for the press, but for a company of one: himself. He could not undo what had been done to Luciana by a single act, but he could choose where to direct his power. He could choose to stand by the 2 children who still believed that people could mean safety. He gathered himself, pulled up the file the nurse had handed over, and called a number he had found on a local legal aid directory. He was careful in his words, soft but precise. Describe the allegation, describe the consequences, record dates, request counsel. The process would be slow. It would require proof, patience, and a willingness to expose a truth in public spaces that could be ugly. As he hung up, his phone lit with a message from Pedro. A photo of Bia asleep with her thumb in her mouth and a single caption: "She smiled today." Ricardo looked at the picture, and let a small relief wash through him. The image was tiny, but its truth was enormous. It signaled that, under care, life could stitch itself back together. He was about to step into the next move, calling a private investigator, arranging for legal counsel, contacting the former workplace, when Claudia came in with news that tightened the air. The employer's family had made statements, and a young woman had been interviewed by the police claiming to have seen something. That detail, innocuous at first blush, had the potential to unravel in ways that would reach far beyond one person. Ricardo sat very still for a moment. The case had shifted from immediate rescue to a question of public truth. The stakes were no longer only about food and medical care. They included a reputation swallowed by rumor, livelihoods lost, and the ripple effect on two small children. He stood up, smoothed his shirt, and walked toward the window. Below, the city pulsed along the avenue. Above the hum of everyday life, the echo of the child's voice from the bakery. "Sir, my little sister can't walk," caught in his mind like a bell. He had answered once. Now he would need to answer again, in a language that required patience, evidence, and when the time came, courage. He did not yet know how the truth would reveal itself. He only knew that he could not walk away. The pinky promise he had made would have to hold. He called someone he trusted. Mateus, a private investigator who had once tracked down a missing heirloom for a friend, and owed Ricardo nothing but a reputation for getting facts. Mateus arrived with a small bag, a tired look, and the kind of patience that meant he believed truth could be unearthed, given enough quiet work. If you've ever seen something like this on your street, drop your city below, because this isn't only a story about one family, it could be any one of us. Mateus started with what the world leaves behind: papers, receipts, phones, and CCTV. He began where lies are most brittle, around other people. He walked to the laundry where Luciana had worked and spoke to co-workers, to the night supervisor, to anyone who would tell what they had seen without a lawyer's script. He pulled the shift rosters, found the locker where Luciana kept her things, and found the small bruise in the lining of a jacket that matched the description Pedro had given of the moment someone shoved at a pocket. Tiny, almost invisible, but everything in a fact-finder's hand. Then Mateus turned to digital crumbs. He asked around the staff about who used a certain messaging app. One worker, hesitant at first, admitted that Fernanda, the boss's daughter, had been volatile the week Luciana was fired. There had been arguments over small things, and Fernanda had a habit of showing off new purchases. The worker swallowed hard and, after a long pause, said she'd seen a bracelet like the one Pedro described on Fernanda's vanity the morning after Luciana vanished. She'd said nothing because she feared losing her own job. That hesitant witness opened a doorway. Mateus used routine investigative legwork, subpoenas arranged through Ricardo's lawyer, polite requests, and quiet conversations, to get access to the laundry's backroom footage. The camera angles were grainy, the timestamp a little off, but there it was. A figure with a familiar gait slipping into the locker area, lingering long enough to be suspicious, then leaving with a package the size of a necklace box. The face was turned away once, but enough of the silhouette, hair tied back, the confident tilt of shoulders, hung in the frame for someone who knew Fernanda to recognize the walk. Mateus kept digging. He traced payment records, found a small boutique transaction 2 days before Luciana was accused, and pulled a receipt from a pawnshop where an unfamiliar necklace had briefly been sold and then quickly reclaimed. Then he found the thing that would turn suspicion into proof. A screenshot. It came from a backup a friend of Fernanda's had stored in the cloud. The screenshot showed a message exchange, the kind you'd expect between people who thought they could be clever without consequence. An image of a necklace, a laughing emoji, words suggesting placement and timing. The messages read like idle cruelty at first glance, but then one line stood out: "Do it before she gets paid Friday." In the screenshot, the sender's profile picture matched the boutique receipt, and a name the laundry staff recognized. Ricardo read the prints in a small room with the blinds drawn. His jaw hardened and softened in the same breath, anger at the betrayal, and the quiet relief of a direction to follow. He thought of Luciana's pale hands, of Pedro's defense of his sister, of the Mindinho promise that had asked him to stay. He and his lawyer, Marta Silva, chose their route with care. This wasn't about spectacle, it was about clearing a name and restoring a life. Marta drafted a civil suit for defamation and wrongful termination, prepared to ask the court for compensation and a public retraction. She insisted on building an airtight chronology: the boutique receipt, the pawnshop print, the screenshot, the CCTV, and witness testimony. Each piece had to link. No leaps, only steps. Mateus found more. A security guard at the office parking lot remembered that on the day of the accusation, Fernanda had come in early and given an unusual instruction to the cleaning staff. A delivery log keyed to the boutique purchase showed a single pendant matching the description of the necklace had been purchased and then returned in a way that raised questions. With every small piece, the narrative shifted from rumor to a pattern of deliberate action. Ricardo struggled with a familiar tension, to use his resources loudly or to let the law move. Public exposure could hurt Luciana again. It could humiliate a family and a company. But silence could leave the lie in the world, a stain that would keep staining. "We'll do this carefully," Marta said. "We'll ask for what she needs, damages, a retraction, and documentation that clears her. We'll not trade dignity for drama." When they filed suit, the city's attention was small at first, an item in the legal pages, a local anchor's curiosity. Then the former employer, worried about reputation, issued a terse statement that sounded more like a shield than an answer. "We acted on the information we had at the time," it read. The daughter's friends rallied to her on social media with comments that assumed guilt because it was easiest. The pattern Ricardo had feared slowly began to appear. A large company eager to distance itself from scandal, a family defensive, a worker's life left in the crossfire. Mateus pressed on. He found a chat backup on a phone belonging to a friend of Fernanda's, a smug exchange where someone joked about planting the pretty thing and praised the timing. A witness, one of the laundry's part-time night staff, Maria, came forward under the shield of Ricardo's attorney. She spoke with a voice that trembled because coming forward carried consequences, but she spoke. She testified that Fernanda had taken a cup of coffee into the locker room the night before Luciana's dismissal, that she had been unusually agitated, and had left the room with a small object in her hand. The defense lawyers attempted to paint Maria as unreliable, changeable under the pressure of a courtroom. They suggested the surveillance footage was grainy and the screenshot possibly doctored. They argued the company had acted in good faith based on what they believed to be an employee theft. There were long procedural days where truth and legal strategy tangled. In the quiet between depositions, Ricardo sat with Pedro and explained things as one would explain a map to a child. He didn't preach. He said simply, "We're going to show them what happened." Pedro listened like someone watching a tide come in, full of a mix of fear and quiet confidence that the shore would appear in the end. The trial, when it came, felt both larger and painfully intimate. Reporters lined the steps outside the courthouse like migratory birds, cameras angled for a reaction shot. The courtroom itself was packed. Neighbors, former colleagues, a few of Ricardo's business associates, who had come because they believed in the decency he'd shown. Lucia, when she arrived, wore clothes that had been bought by Ricardo in the months since. Simple, clean garments, selected to restore dignity, not to make a point. She looked small in the aisle, but steady when she took her seat beside Marta. The plaintiff's case unfolded with the deliberate patience of someone who has pieces that fit. Mateus went on the stand and explained the digital trail. Timestamps, geolocations, a chain of messages that connected Fernanda to the boutique purchase and the conversation about placement. The CCTV footage was played in slow motion. The figure in the locker room paused where a pocket would be. Maria gave her testimony, voice firm now that she felt she was finally telling the truth. When Luciana took the stand, she spoke softly and without flourishes. She described the day she was accused, the confusion, the humiliation of being escorted from the workplace, the way her mother's voice had sounded when she called and asked why she'd been let go. She described losing the job that paid the bills and the months that followed where food became a calculation and sleep a luxury. She did not embellish. The power of her testimony was in the ordinary details that showed what untruth did to a life. Fernanda, in her defense, claimed an error in judgment and insisted she'd only reported what she believed she saw. On cross-examination, however, the tone shifted. Marta read out messages in which Fernanda's laughter and planning were plain. She elicited testimony from the boutique clerk who remembered a hurried return. She produced the pawnshop slip. The defense scrambled to explain, to raise questions about chain of custody for the evidence, to suggest that motive was not proof. But a pattern is more than a single line item. It's a chorus of details all pointing the same way. Outside the court, the city's indifference had turned into a curiosity that bordered on moral discomfort. Some onlookers whispered that maybe they should have asked when they saw Luciana in the street. Others murmured that the world moves too fast to notice everything. In a small human way, the trial forced reflection. After days of testimony and argument, the judge rendered a decision that felt like a long-held breath finally released. The ruling found in favor of Luciana on the claims of wrongful termination and defamation. The court ordered the company to publish a retraction and apology, awarded compensation for lost wages and damage to reputation, and directed the employer to implement better internal review processes before taking action on accusations. The judge's voice, calm, precise, made it clear the law had been satisfied that Luciana had been wronged. There was a moment of stunned silence that rippled through the room like a physical wave. Luciana's shoulders trembled. Pedro, who had sat quiet through the hearings, reached for his mother's hand and squeezed as if anchoring something he feared might lift. Fernanda's face registered a mix of shame and fury, the complicated reaction of someone caught between a youthful act and adult consequences. The company issued a statement that read differently now. The apology was measured, the retraction placed where public records could find it. The social media posts that had cheered on the accusation were taken down or edited with forced regrets. For Luciana, the legal victory was not a sudden solution to every need, but it was a doorway. The compensation money allowed for secure housing, a stable food situation, and the possibility of a job with support. More importantly, the official retraction cleared a public stain. The media, which had been hungry for spectacle, found something quieter to report. A woman vindicated, 2 children no longer hiding from the world, and a businessman who had chosen to stop his car. There were op-eds about responsibility and corporate haste, columns about the vulnerability of those in precarious employment, and, tucked between them, human interest pieces that focused on the family rebuilding. Ricardo did not take center stage. He declined interviews that sought to portray him as a savior. In private, he told Marta he had only done what anyone with the means should do when faced with a clear injustice. Yet even he felt the tug of something deeper, that small decisions ripple farther than we imagine. The pinky promise that had seemed so simple in the bakery had become, in a way, the hinge on which a life turned. Restoration is rarely instantaneous. The months that followed the judgment were measured in appointments, in nutrition plans, in therapy sessions for both body and pride. Luciana worked with a nutritionist to rebuild strength. The regimen included monitored meals, counseling about routines, and gradual reintroduction of activity. She attended classes to update skills and, with Ricardo's assistance, enrolled in a vocational training program that respected her experience while opening new doors. She received job offers that came with oversight and clear protections, designed to prevent a repeat of what had happened. Pedro began school again, the first days awkward, full of the small trials children face when they return to a world that had seemed distant. Teachers noted his protective instincts. They enrolled him in a child counseling group where he learned language for feelings he had carried in silence. Bia's physical condition improved steadily. She began working with a pediatric therapist to rebuild muscle tone and coordination. At first, it was swaddling exercises and guided stepping. Then the halting, triumphant moments when she took a tentative foot forward, and then another. The staff at the clinic measured progress in millimeters, and each small gain was celebrated as if it were a victory in a long campaign. Ricardo visited often, but not to supervise. He came with groceries and a lamp that had once sat in his office, and a habit of asking quietly how he could be useful. Claudia oversaw a schedule that linked medical appointments and schooling, and Seu Jorge, who had been there at the beginning, often left small toys or books, sent with a soft, gruff tenderness. In time, they moved into a modest apartment that Ricardo helped secure, a place with a small courtyard where Bia could take unstructured steps and discover that walking could also be play. It was not a gift that erased the past, but an act that provided stability. Luis, Matias, or whatever names the city might have provided to other families, were irrelevant. This was Luciana's life, being reassembled with patient, practical hands. There were awkward moments, of course. When Luciana met with her old employer's HR team to finalize the retraction wording, she felt a nausea that was not entirely gone. In private, she cried, not from weakness, but from the sheer fatigue of having to prove that she was innocent. The settlement eased practical burdens, but it could not return time or soften the memory of accusation. Yet those who had watched the process unfold saw in her a new kind of steadiness, hard-won and quiet. The chosen family that slowly emerged around them formed not out of spectacle, but out of everyday obligations. Ricardo learned the names of Pedro's friends' parents. He sat through a parents' meeting for a school fundraiser, feeling awkward in a room he had never before occupied. He visited during a sick day, and held a groggy Bia while Luciana rested. The Mindinho promise showed up again not as a romantic trope, but as a memory. The small curl of fingers that had asked for presents. 6 months after the verdict, the apartment's morning routine had a cadence. Luciana prepared porridge with a steadier hand. Pedro recited a small list of things he planned to do that day. Go to school, read a book, help with the dishes. Bia ran, in short bursts, across the tiles, and fell and then rose up giggling, the way children do when their muscles and trust are being rebuilt. Ricardo stood in the doorway one morning, watching them, and realized that his life had broadened into something that included these small domestic moments. He had been a man of meetings and margins. Now he found himself more comfortable with a crayon on a fridge than a spreadsheet. On a Thursday that smelled faintly of rain, Ricardo sat at the small kitchen table, while Luciana measured out cereal. Pedro, becoming less of a shield and more of a boy, took the cup and offered Ricardo his pinky, the gesture both ritual and blessing. Ricardo hooked his finger in without ceremony. The promise had been fulfilled in actions, not in grand pronouncements. "You kept your promise," Pedro said, as if counting what made the world make sense. Ricardo swallowed. "You kept yours too," he answered. The city that had once looked away glanced in later and sometimes nodded, a small civic recognition that someone had been treated fairly. The company issued a training module on handling accusations. The daughter, Fernanda, faced private consequences and, in time, public contrition. She later published a short apology, words thinner than the harm, but she lived with them. She agreed to participate in a restorative program recommended by the court, designed to expose privileged people to the consequences of small cruelties. The program was not a panacea, but it forced some accountability. For Luciana, the greatest restitution was the ability to rebuild routines that belonged to her. Morning coffee with a neighbor, a job that paid reliably, the sound of a child walking across a room. She sometimes whispered thanks in private, not always to a deity, but to the chain of small human acts that had steadied her. Someone stopping a car, a baker sharing bread, a man who used his privilege to demand a hearing. Those acts did not make her life perfect, but they shifted the balance in favor of dignity. Ricardo, who had once measured days by meetings, now measured them in the texture of lives around him. A tutor's patience with Pedro's math, a therapist's careful plan for Bia, Luciana's laugh when she found a recipe that worked. He understood, in a new, quieter way, that responsibility is not a single heroic act, but a long habit of showing up. The economic decisions he had once agonized over seemed attuned now to a different ledger, the one that balances power with presence. One evening, as the family sat on the small couch watching a program that played in the background while Bia crawled into Pedro's lap, Ricardo felt something like home settle in him. The pinky promise had matured into mutual reliance. He leaned on them as much as they had leaned on him. He had chosen to stop on an avenue. They had chosen to let him stay. The reciprocity in that decision was the revelation. The story did not end in a single courtroom or a single headline. The slow work continued. Medical follow-ups, school reports, moments of insecurity, the practical bargaining of appointments and paychecks. But there was a guiding truth they all carried. Small interventions changed trajectories, not because one person is special, but because one person decided to act when action was available. Months later, when a reporter asked Ricardo why he had chosen to stay in the bakery that day, he looked at the children playing and said something that had no grandiosity. Because someone had to. It was that simple. The reporter tried to turn the phrase into a moral, but Ricardo resisted easy endings. "It's not about praise," he said. "It's about responsibility. We all have opportunities to choose what kind of city we want to be." Luciana, standing by a window looking at the light across the courtyard, sometimes thought of that first sidewalk, the woman who had brushed by without looking, the man with a briefcase who had pretended not to notice. She thought about how life without witnesses had felt before someone finally saw her clearly and decided to stay. She leaned her forehead against the glass and breathed. The world, she realized, could be different if people chose to be different. The chosen family they had become did not erase pain, but it rewove belonging into their days. Pedro drew a picture for Ricardo that hung on the fridge for months, 3 stick figures holding hands, a sun scribbled big over them. Beneath, in childish letters, he wrote, "Promise kept." It was, to Ricardo, evidence of a subtle victory, the restoration of trust in small hands. What mattered most in the end was not the money paid out or the apology printed in a newspaper. It was the fact that a life that had been written off was now writing its own sentences again. It was that a child who feared losing her mother could now run, not perfectly at first, but with growing confidence toward school, friends, and a future that included more than survival. As for the man who had once felt the tick of his wrist like a drumbeat of obligation, he learned a surprising lesson. Sometimes the appointments that matter most are the ones that happen in the margins, the last-minute detours, the moments you did not budget for. They shape a different kind of portfolio, one that includes human stories and not just fiscal sheets. The question the story leaves is quietly demanding. When you see someone whose life is on a hinge, will you stop? Will you step into something that has no guarantee of ease, but holds the possibility of redemption? It isn't a question that asks for theatrical sacrifice, but for simple presence. If this moved you, share it with someone who needs a reminder that stopping matters. Subscribe for more real-life stories that show how small choices make big differences.